The Protege Program by SolarCalamity. Chapter 8, Computer Programming and Nedzu. Trigger warnings. Mentions of beating/bullying, undisclosed punishments, unfair punishment, being drugged, being watched and studied, mentions of the uncanny valley. Izuku sucked in a deep breath as he entered the computer lab, noting the strong scent of cedar in the air. Not that that was surprising. The building was primarily built out of cedar wood. He turned to his left and held his card up to the activity log, taking the time it needed to load properly to survey the room. The cedar building, which was smaller on the inside than it was on the outside, was rectangular in shape, with a completely average number of regular windows, if you didn't count the almost entirely glass ceiling, which was crisscrossed with fluorescent light sticks, each of which sat over a desk. There were 18 long rectangular desks, each of which had a list of names hanging off the side stating who should sit where. Facing the front of the room, which was to Izuku's right, where Nedzu stood on a platform that was, Izuku would say, 7 feet off the ground, smiling slightly. How fascinating. I wonder how it feels to smile with a non-human face. Does Nedzu have opposable thumbs? Maybe... Izuku was snapped out of his internal rambling by the activity log beeping at him twice. Right. Mustn't stare at Nedzu. He started making his way towards the desk with his name on it. Since there didn't seem to be any particular order they were required to sit in, Izuku opted to sit next to the wall, wanting to limit the number of sides he could be ambushed from. He could still be approached from the front, but there was a desk and a computer in the way of any potential assailant from that direction, and 4 more desks between his own and the raised platform in the front of the room where Nedzu still stood. He could obviously be ambushed from his right, where the door was, but if he kept his chair angled slightly in that direction, he would see anyone coming. Anyone who wanted to attack from behind him would have to either approach from his right or either leap over or crawl under the desk behind him. There were small, almost invisible doors scattered through the room, likely for Nedzu's personal use. Let's see, if there are 18 desks and each desk holds 6 computers, then that would mean 107 students at any given time, not including myself. Add Nedzu into that, and there are 108 people here who could attack me, and 4 directions they could attack from. 4 directions, not 3, because there were small wooden beams, each no more than a foot across, around 15 feet above the floor. They crisscrossed the entire room. That meant that people, Nedzu probably, could easily attack him from above, too. Not great. Izuku knew from years of sneaking around and having to evade notice to escape beatings, and worse, that most people simply didn't look up. It was likely that Nedzu was betting on that fact in order to let him keep an eye on the students from a better angle without most of them realizing it. Izuku would have to be careful. He was fully aware of his habit of getting caught in his own head, but he couldn't let himself do that here. He had to stay focused, had to not zone out or mumble. It wouldn't be easy for him. He thought best when he was mumbling or writing. He couldn't risk bringing out his notebook and it being confiscated or damaged, so he'd just have to write on his arm. Izuku snapped back to reality when a bell chimed over the overhead speakers, signaling the start of class. Nedzu greeted the room of gathered junior high students, and now that Izuku looked around, he realized it wasn't even half full. He'd have to do a head count later. Am I a mouse, a dog, a bear? Who knows? More importantly, I am Nedzu, and I will be teaching computer programming class. Today, we will start with the basics. Nedzu was hoping that he'd be able to find a personal student sooner rather than later. Teaching could be amusing, sure, but it wasn't interesting. Everything could be predicted or handled easily. It had been so long since he had found someone worth spending his time on. The computer science room was designed to host 108 students, but it wasn't even half full. He had been disappointed, but not surprised, when 302 out of the original 500 students for the program had left during orientation, leaving a mere 198 students left. His staff were relieved they wouldn't have to deal with such immense class sizes, he was sure. Nedzu just hoped that there hadn't been any geniuses in that group that he now wouldn't get to meet. The previous class had been irritating. One of the students had tried to fistfight another, 2 had gotten into a yelling match within 40 seconds of entering the building, and the majority of the students at the back of the classroom had spent their time gossiping about Nedzu himself, likely thinking he couldn't hear them. Well, he could. He had heard everything they had to say, from a speculation of what exactly he was, which didn't bother Nedzu much at all, to comments about how easy it would be to kill him, They were all quite incorrect in their assumption. Nedzu may be small, but he was not defenseless. To a group of 8 or so students in the very back of the class who had spent their time quietly debating how much money they'd get if they could capture him and bring him back to the Hero and Public Safety Commission. Naturally, the latter two groups of people had been expelled instantly, and that group of 8 had been permanently barred from UA campus and events, including the sports festival. Nedzu had emailed the children's parents, as well as all the other respectable hero schools in Japan that he was on good terms with, getting them barred from all the reputable hero schools in the country. Nedzu did not get offended or upset easily. Most human problems didn't apply to him. However, he found that most humans got quite upset when some of their subordinates discussed how best to kill them, so he rather doubted that he had overreacted at all. He had wanted to be harsher with that group of 8, but getting them blacklisted and frightening them a bit was as far as he could go without risking legal trouble or rumor spreading. Hopefully this class will be better, Nedzu thought as students began filing in the room. With the total number of students in the program now being a mere 165, the room would not even be half full by the time class started. Nedzu let his eyes flick back over to the door just as a small, green-haired boy walked in, and Nedzu recognized him as Midori Izuku, the only quirkless student in the program. It wasn't his quirklessness that made him stand out, more so the fact that he had checked to make sure that he was actually allowed in the program, despite the website and documents clearly stating that quirk status would not have any effect on their application. Nedzu had decided to keep an eye on the boy, not necessarily because anything about him screamed genius, simply because the quirkless had horrible lives, and, personal student or not, Nedzu wanted to help this kid if he could. Midori used his ID to log in, something that most of the last class had forgotten to do, and let his eyes wander. After just a moment, his eyes landed on Nedzu himself. Nedzu expected many things from the boy. Curiosity, unease, fright, maybe even disgust if he had heard the rumors about Nedzu being an amalgamation of different creatures. The only thing he hadn't expected was what he saw. Midoriya studied Nedzu. Not in the way you study and memorize the face of someone you've just met, no. Midoriya Izuku was studying Nedzu in the same way Nedzu was studying him. Nedzu had to restrain himself from giving a full, unrestrained grin, knowing better than to show his teeth to anyone who wasn't an enemy. The activity log Midori was holding his ID up to blinked green, but the kid didn't notice, his wide eyes still pinned on Nedzu. It wasn't until the activity log beeped twice half a moment later that Midori blinked, straightened, turned back to the activity log, and pulled his ID away. He glanced back up at Nedzu briefly before ducking his head and trudging forward, finding his desk and choosing to sit against the wall. Fascinating. Not necessarily his choice to sit by the wall, or the way he had seemed to make himself appear smaller. No, what was fascinating was the fact that Midoriya had turned back to the activity log after the first beep had sounded, but before the second had. That in and of itself wouldn't have been anything unusual, if not for the fact that the first beep was at a frequency that humans shouldn't have been able to hear. Only the second beep should have been audible to humans. Was it coincidence? Had Midoriya simply remembered what he had been doing at the exact second the log had beeped? It seemed Nedzu would have to keep an eye on the kid for multiple reasons. A bell chimed over the speakers. Time for class to start, then. Were Nedzu of regular intelligence, he would have to put Midori Izuku out of his mind in order to properly start teaching, but Nedzu was more than capable of doing a mundane task like teaching a beginner's computer programming class and theorizing at the same time. Am I a mouse, a dog, a bear? Who knows? More importantly, I am Nedzu, and I will be teaching computer programming class. Today, we will start with the basics, he announced. He'd get the students started, wait a little while for them to ask all their questions about the assignment, then take to the makeshift catwalks above the room in order to keep an eye on the students, see how many of them were willing to goof off on the first day if they thought they were left without supervision, and, more importantly and most interestingly, study Midori Izuku from up close. The assignment Nedzu had given them was incredibly easy. It had to be. Most junior high students wouldn't have much, if any, experience with computers. If Nedzu had been in Eldera, he would have had to figure out how well the teacher wanted him to do, how well he was expected to do, and how well Bakugo did. That way, he wouldn't score so high that he'd surpass Bakugo, read, get beaten up, get accused of cheating, read, get sent to see Yamazaki-sensei, who was usually the one dealing with cheating allegations, or score so low they'd have to stay after class for tutoring, read, An irritating menial task, getting scolded, potentially getting drugged. Izuku hoped to avoid that one for the rest of his life. That had been unpleasant. Or having to redo the assignment. Here, though, the biggest risk, aside from pissing off Nedzu, was scoring too low and getting kicked out of the program. So he actually put a bit of effort into the assignment Nedzu had given them. Only a bit, because it really wasn't difficult. He probably could have done it just as easily when he was 7, but some of the others seemed to be struggling with it. Nedzu answered any questions that were asked of him, but after a few minutes, it became clear that no more questions were forthcoming. Izuku was getting bored. He had finished the assignment, and there was nothing else to do. He dug through his pockets for a pen, uncapped it, and pushed his right sleeve up a bit. It would have been better to write on his left arm instead, since it was in the line of sight for precisely no one, but oh well. That wasn't a viable option right now. Izuku began jotting down notes about the program so far, including the demeanor of each teacher he'd met so far, building layout, places to hide if need be, and strategies for staying out of trouble. When he ran out of normal things to write, he began to brainstorm. This wasn't a viable option in the long run. He was going to run out of space on his arm sooner or later, regardless of how small he wrote, not to mention he'd be in trouble if his mother or any of his teachers at Aldera caught him with ink on his skin. They'd accuse him of having an underage tattoo for sure. It wasn't safe to bring out his notebooks in front of other people, though, so how could he take notes of his thoughts and ideas without risk? If they were using personal computers, he could have just switched tabs and typed out his thoughts, but they weren't. Typing. His own computer. What he needed was a way to type on his computer without bringing it with him. A portable keyboard? The other kids would likely destroy that, or it might be confiscated. So, an interactive hologram then? Too noticeable. Maybe he could build a miniature interactive holographic keyboard, something that put the letters on his palms instead of on the desk or something. He'd need to be able to turn the visual display off so no one could see it, and it would need to be linked to his personal computer. Let's see. There are 71 relevant keys if the only goal is to type. Letters, numbers, and symbols can be stacked. 34 regular dual-purpose buttons, plus the space button and the shift button. There are 35 places I can easily tap with the fingers of one hand. I'll configure the order of the keys later. The space key will be on the thumb pad, the others jumbled around. Maybe I can find a way to make shift not a button, but a motion. It would have to be something that wouldn't impede my ability to touch any of the other buttons. Maybe pressing my index, middle, and ring fingers together, but leaving the pinky out? That would work. Ideally, I'd have it be a two-handed keyboard, but, well, that wouldn't work for me right now, and it's easier to hide fidgeting with one hand than with two, so it works out anyway. By the time Izuku finished jotting down his plan, his entire right arm was covered in ink. He wasn't writing in any cohesive language, having learned at a young age not to write analysis or designs in a way that let anyone else read them. It was a code. The only clear thing was a simple drawing of a left hand with 34 spots marked on the palm and fingers, with the pinky held out from the other fingers. It would suck if I lost the design the next time I go to the bathroom and wash my hands. I really should write it down in my notebook, Izuku decided. Nedzu was watching Midori Izuku from above, and had been doing so for 6 minutes now. The boy had finished the assignment quickly, it seemed, and spent the time since then writing on his arm. Nedzu had already been interested in the child, but the fact that he was clearly writing some kind of code made him all the more intriguing. What was more was that Nedzu couldn't figure out the code. Normally it was a matter of minutes or mere seconds to figure out a code. But the only thing Nedzu could clearly determine was a simple drawing of a left hand with 35 small circles drawn on the palm and underside of the fingers. Each circle contained 2 small symbols, except the one on the pad of the thumb, which had 5 symbols written on it, each of which were already somewhere else on the hand. As Nedzu watched, Midoriya looked around himself surreptitiously as if checking for witnesses, then pulled a notebook out of his jacket and flipped it open to the first blank page, 4 pages into the book. From what Nedzu could tell, the book seemed to be written in code as well, if the symbols on the cover of it were anything to go off of. Midoriya quickly copied everything he'd written onto his arm onto the paper. How interesting. Only the first real day of the program, and already I have a protege candidate. Nedzu felt himself grin. He'd have to learn more about this boy. Nedzu didn't know much about the boy beyond direct observations. There were quite a few things to speculate about him. For now, though, the only things he knew for sure about Midori Izuku were this. He was observant for a 14-year-old. There were a few small, nearly unnoticeable scars on his face, including, but probably not limited to, if the slight sheen of makeup on the boy's forehead was any indication, small dots above and below his lips, and a crooked scar over the bridge of his nose. Twice now, Midori had pulled out a small compact mirror and checked in it, perhaps making sure the makeup hadn't smudged or come off. There was also some very slight discoloration on certain parts of his skin, surrounding the right side of his face from the middle of his hairline in a curved line dropping down to his cheekbone, then hooking over to his ear where the skin went back to being the color that the rest of his face was. It wasn't at all noticeable. It was something one would only pick up on if they spent enough time studying Midori's face, and if they had enough color receptors, of course. It was almost as if someone had dyed that part of Midori's face a few shades lighter than the rest of it, or like he'd tanned unevenly. Midori had yet to use his right hand for anything, even the assignment. It didn't hang limply at his side the way it might if it were dislocated or if he couldn't feel it, but it was safe to assume the boy was left-handed. His eyes blinked at slightly different speeds, his right faster than his left. There was also something slightly off about the child's eye. It looked... Nedzu couldn't put his paw on it, but there was something off about it. He didn't actually look any different from his left eye, but it was making Nedzu ever so slightly uneasy, more so the more time he spent looking at it. It had been a while since Nedzu had experienced the uncanny valley effect, which was theorized to have evolved in early history humans, needing to differentiate between fellow Homo sapiens and different human-like species, like the Homo neanderthalensis. The ability to experience the uncanny valley effect had mostly died out with the emergence of quirks, as well as the ability to sense when you were being watched. It's exceedingly rare for any modern human to be able to detect the uncanny valley, the not-quite humans. Most of those remaining who can are quirkless. In fact, the only quirked person Nedzu had ever met who could detect the uncanny valley was Aizawa Shota, and it had served the man well in his career as an underground hero. The ability to tell if there were eyes on you was only slightly less rare. Nedzu had met a handful of people with that ability, but most people in this day and age couldn't tell if they were being watched or listened to. It made subterfuge and information gathering much easier than it likely was prior to the rise of quirks. Most animals still had the ability to detect the uncanny valley and whether they were being watched, but with every generation that passed, more and more quirked animals were reported to have lost those senses. It truly was a fascinating phenomenon. Right now, Nedzu was getting the feeling that Midori Izuku was not quite right. The same sort of not quite right feeling that Aizawa Shota described getting from Nedzu himself. Fascinating. It could be any number of things, but this certainly warranted further study. Nedzu wondered if the boy in question could detect the uncanny valley or people's eyes on him. It was likely he could not, seeing as he had not reacted in any way to Nedzu watching him from above. Nedzu was filled with immense disappointment when the bell signaling the end of the second block of computer science sounded over the loudspeakers. Silent sighs of relief and complaints of "finally" rang out through the classroom as the students hurried to dismiss themselves, most forgetting to actually log out of the room with their IDs. Midori Izuku simply stood up without a sound, put his notebook back in his jacket's internal pocket, logged out, and left. Nedzu sighed. He had meant to study all of the students while he was in the rafters, but Midori Izuku was too fascinating to look away from for long. Perhaps next week Nedzu would give those who seemed to excel in computer programming harder assignments. It would be better for the students to not have to learn at anyone else's pace, and it would let him give Midori more difficult assignments to see what the boy really knew without singling him out. For now, though, Nedzu needed to get back to the front of the classroom before the next block of students arrived. Izuku let out a shaky breath once he was more than 10 feet away from the computer science building. Nedzu had been watching him for almost 15 minutes. He'd first noticed the eyes on him while he was writing on his arm. At first, he had assumed it was one of the other students judging him for drawing on himself instead of doing the assignment, but that theory had been disproven when he'd noticed the impressively quiet sound of breathing coming from above him. He'd pulled out his mirror a minute later and angled it just so, allowing him to see white fur above him. Izuku's hands were shaking more than usual now. Nedzu had been right above him, watching him. Crap. Izuku didn't think he'd been breaking any rules, but then again, he was quirkless. The rules were always different for him. Did Nedzu notice Izuku noticing him? Was he angry? Creeped out? Izuku shuddered and made his way towards interactive chemistry. The buildings for interactive chemistry and basic mechanics were on the opposite side of the program's select section of campus, likely to prevent an accident in either building from triggering an accident in the other. All the buildings were equidistant from the computer programming building, most likely to keep kids from being late to class simply because they were too far away to get there on time. The chemistry building was across the path, a simple stone path that connected all the program's buildings, its small courtyard, and a jungle gym structure that Izuku suspected was for parkour, whenever that was taught from the art building. Izuku was headed for the interactive chemistry building now. He didn't have any sort of project in mind, he just wanted to get away from the computer programming building as soon as possible. He tried to slow his breathing and calm down, but it was hard to do when he'd had the smartest being in the world watching him for 15 minutes straight. Izuku stepped into the interactive chemistry lab, a large marble building with shutters on each window that looked like they could block the sunlight out if closed. He barely had time to log into the activity and process the building's interior. It was large and clean, with at least 50 small floor tables, accompanied by 4 floor cushions each. There were at least 20 different doors set into the walls of the room, each labeled with something different. Izuku managed to register only 4 signs: basic materials, hazardous materials, miscellaneous materials, and fragile materials, before someone grabbed his shoulder. He jumped and whipped back around to see a boy his age that was at least a whole head taller than Izuku. He had blue hair and eyes, rectangular silver glasses, and was wearing a button-down shirt and slacks and a stern facial expression. It took Izuku a moment to realize there was something sticking out of the back of the boy's legs. Were those engines? It took Izuku a moment longer to realize the boy was holding out a piece of paper for him to take. Izuku flushed red and quickly took the paper with a mumbled apology, quickly reading the paper's title, Basic Lab Safety for Beginners. Mix 13 had said that none of us may do our own experiments until we have a thorough understanding of lab safety, the boy announced in a whisper shout, karate chopping his hand through the air like a robot and punctuating his statement with a quick nod before turning around and speed walking back to the floor table he must have been sitting at before approaching Izuku. Well, this should be interesting.